the accounts that John in his gospel gives us of the miraculous signs that Jesus did. Now, John chooses 7 of them. He actually says Jesus did innumerable miracles, but he chose these 7 because he believed these 7 not only were wonderful demonstrations of divine power, but they also showed us something about who Jesus was and what he came to do. So every one of these miracles is a sign pointing to who he is and what he came to do. This is the 7th and the climactic sign, the last of the 7 signs, and we'll explain why in a minute. Very famous. It's the raising of Lazarus. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were two sisters and a brother who Jesus was particularly close to. He loved them. They were very, very dear and intimate friends. There's a couple of places in the beginning of the chapter, which we didn't read, where it talks about Lazarus being someone that Jesus particularly loved. Of course, down in verse 36, 35 and 36, it says, "See how he loved him." But Lazarus became sick when Jesus was away, and he died, and now Jesus comes to the tomb, and he comes to all the people mourning and grieving, and this is where the narrative picks up. What we're going to see tonight is what the text teaches us under the 2 headings I've already mentioned. What does this text teach us about who Jesus is and what he came to do? And when we see him dealing with the 2 sisters, I think we learn who he is. And when we see him dealing with the tomb, going to the tomb and Lazarus himself, we come to understand what he came to do, who he is, what he came to do. Now, who he is revealed by the way in which he deals with Mary and Martha. Notice, and I read this thing for years before I noticed. Martha, first thing she says to him when Jesus arrives is, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But did you notice down in verse 32 that when Mary comes out to see Jesus, she also says, word for word, the same thing. She says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." So you have 2 women in the very same situation, both suffering the same way, both under the same kind of grief, and even saying the very, very same words, and yet Jesus' response to them is utterly different, almost the opposite. With Martha, he essentially argues with her. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. It's never too late." So he's kind of looking at her sorrow, the sorrow of her heart, and he's sort of standing up against the sorrow of her heart, and he's calling her to hope. But with Mary, he not only doesn't argue with her, he doesn't give her any advice. He doesn't say anything to her. He just weeps. He doesn't stand against the flow of her heart's sorrow. He enters into it. He goes right into it. Now, how do you explain how utterly different this is? I actually read a commentary which I thought was absolutely right and said, this is not fiction. No fiction writer would have thought this up. Here's 2 women in the very same situation, saying the very same thing, and Jesus responds to them in completely opposite ways. This disjunction is not something that some fiction writer would have imagined. This is an eyewitness remembering what happened, but this is more than just a counterintuitive curiosity. I think we see here Jesus revealing who he is. To Martha, he's revealing himself as God. And to Mary, he's showing himself to be human. In other words, Jesus Christ is the God-man. He's the God-man. He's divine and he's human. And he's revealing this to these sisters. So with Martha, what does he say? He does not say, "Hey, I have access to divine power that could raise this man from the dead." He doesn't say that. He says, "I am the power that gives everything life." That's what he means when he says, I am the resurrection. The resurrection. It's not just I can raise him from the dead. I am the resurrection and the life means I am the source of all life. I am the power that gives everything life. Now, only God has got that. And therefore, to Martha, he's claiming to be God. But to Mary, he's showing himself to be a man. A weak, weeping human being. Because you see, his love for the family draws him right down into their devastation. He's just weeping. Why? Because, see, he feels the horror of death. He feels the devastating grief of having lost love. He feels it because he's human. He's mortal. And so, yes, here's a powerful deity that has assumed vulnerable humanity. Here is one who is crushed with grief. And therefore, what we have is someone who is both divine and human. Now, at this point, it'd be fairly easy to kind of go into it and start to say, okay, this is the doctrine of Christ. Christ is fully divine and fully human. You know, there's all kinds of great doctrinal names for this. It's called the hypostatic union, which means the union of the divinity and the humanity in one person. And we could go to Philippians chapter 2 or a couple of those passages, and we could kind of parse everything and talk about how this works, that Jesus Christ, though God, emptied himself of his glory, but did not empty himself of his deity and took on humanity. All right, that's very, very important, extremely important. But I think for now, in a worship service before the Lord's Supper, I think I would rather just say, as much as this boggles the mind, the idea that Jesus could be both divine and human, as much as this is hard to understand, it is what your heart needs. You need a God-man for a Savior. You need a divine human man, someone who's incredibly high and incredibly low at once. How? Two ways. First of all, because he's infinitely high and infinitely low at once, he's the wonderful counselor. He's the perfect, wonderful counselor. Look again. What is he giving Martha? The ministry of truth. I am the resurrection and the life. A bracing response, confrontation. That's the ministry of truth. What's he giving to Mary, though? The ministry of tears. He's just weeping with her. He's just sharing with her. He's just moving on in. Now, why? Why so different? I'll tell you why. Because each woman needed exactly that at that moment. Now, as a pastor, pastors do a lot of counseling, and anyone who's done counseling over the years, some of you are counselors, some of you just have done a lot of it. One of the things you come to realize as time goes on, and it's an uncomfortable realization, is that there is a limited range of people that you can really help, that any of us can help. Do you know why? Well, first of all, some people do need to be confronted. Sometimes people at the moment of greatest need, they need confrontation, they need the ministry of truth. Other people need the ministry of tears. They need support. They don't need advice. They don't need confrontation. They need support. And if you give support to someone when they need to be confronted, or if you confront someone when they need to be supported, or if you confront them when they need to be supported, maybe they need to be supported, then confronted, maybe they need to be confronted, then supported, and you get it wrong, you harm them. Now, the fact of the matter is, all of us have what's called a temperament. Do you know what a temperament is? A habitual way of dealing with reality. And there is nobody who's equally good at truth and tears. Some of us are truthers, and some of us are tearers. Some of us just our default mode, is to weep with people and not push back and not say anything. And some of us, our default mode is say, well, look, I've got to talk to this person. I got to confront this person. And there's like nobody who's the full range. It's like, here's a spectrum of people's needs, and there's none of us as counselors that really can inhabit that full spectrum, but Jesus can. Why? Because he's infinitely high and infinitely low. He is God and yet human. And he's not just high and low, he's perfectly wise, which means he's the wonderful counselor. He always gives you exactly what you need. That's the reason why you've got a passage like this in Hebrews, very famous passage. It says, talking about Jesus, of course, we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace so that we may receive mercy and find help in time of need. Now, do you see the key thing there? He has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. That's the thing. That's the combination. On the one hand, we don't want a sinless God who doesn't know the terror of life. We don't want a sinless God who hasn't been there and hasn't been in our shoes and knows what it means to be crushed under the horror of imminent death and grief and loss. We don't want a sinless God who hasn't experienced what it's like to live our lives. On the other hand, we don't want somebody who's just lived our lives as well as we have. That person can't help us. Well, what do we have? One who has been tested and tempted and experienced everything that we have, but has come through it without sin. Therefore, draw near. Therefore, he understands our weaknesses. Therefore, go to him. You'll always get what you need. Because he's the God-man, he's the wonderful counselor. And secondly, because he's the God-man, he's an absolute beauty. What do I mean, and why do we need that? St. Augustine, I think, was probably the greatest theological mind of all, perhaps. And one of his great insights was what's wrong with the heart. You say, oh, well, what Christians say what's wrong with the heart is sin. Yes, but he got more detailed than that. He says, well, here's how it works. St. Augustine said the problem with our hearts is our loves are disordered. And what that means is our loves are out of order. The thing we should love first, we love fourth. The thing that we should love second, we love fifth. The thing that we should love third, we love first. They're out of order. And in particular, he says, if you love anything more than God, if you put anything number one rather than God, if you love anything more than God, whatever that is, you will crush it with your expectations and it will break your heart. So, for example, if you're married, according to St. Augustine, you have got to love God more than you love your spouse if you're going to love your spouse well. You know why? If you love your spouse more than anything in the world, that sounds so wonderful, doesn't it? I love you more than anything in the world. You know, you're my hope. You're my inspiration. You're my meaning in life. Do you know what you're going to do? You're going to crush that person under the weight of your expectations. When they fail, you're going to be so furious with them. But on the other hand, you're going to be too afraid of their anger to confront them and tell them the truth. Because you can't stand the idea of them being unhappy with you. You see, in other words, you're going to crush them and they're going to break your heart. And therefore, unless you love God supremely, you won't love anyone else well or anything else well. Well, now yesterday, when we had a singles conference right here, and we brought that up a couple of times, when people are talking about, how do you deal with, unrequited longings and all that? We said, well, this is how you do it. And afterwards, I asked, talked to people after the conference was over, and a lot of them plied me with this particular question. They said, okay, I have to love God more than I love anything. How do I do that? I just say, what do I say? I say, I love you, but that doesn't mean I do. I mean, how do I actually love God more than all these other things I love? How can I do that? And then, of course, I said something like, well, you can't just snap your fingers. It's a process. And then, of course, I said, thank you, Pastor. I know it's a process. What is the process? What are you doing in the process? Listen, I can think of nothing better than this. Jonathan Edwards wrote a sermon and then printed it. It's one of the classic sermons in history. I'm sure you can get it online. It's called The Excellence of Christ, or it's an older word, The Excellency of Christ. And what he does was he based the sermon on the place in Revelation where it says that Jesus is both a lion and the lamb. He is God and he's human. He's high and he's low. And the thesis of the sermon was this, that because Jesus is God and human, he is high and low, he combines in himself glories and beauties and excellencies and virtues that would never be combined in the same person. But in the same person, the highness and lowness is absolutely beautiful and compelling. And it engages our hearts. That's what draws your heart out. Not just God, G-O-D, thinking about God. Okay, how am I going to love God? Look at Jesus Christ walking through the pages of the Bible and seeing him as both incredibly high and incredibly low, divine and human at once, combining virtues that would never be combined in any other human being, any other figure. And just to give you an example, let me just read you some people who are trying to get at this in some of their writings. Despite his high claims, this is Jesus, he is never pompous. You never see him standing on his own dignity. He is tenderness without weakness, strength without harshness, humility without the slightest lack of confidence, unhesitating authority with a complete lack of self-absorption, unbending convictions without the slightest lack of approachability, power without insensitivity, enthusiasm without fanaticism, holiness without Phariseeism, passion without prejudice. Nothing he does falls short. In fact, he is always surprising you and taking your breath away because he's incomparably better than you could have imagined. Why? These are the surprises of perfection. See, when he talks about, he says, he despite his incredible claims, never pompous. See? You never see him standing on his own dignity. He combines things that you could see in a high person or a low person, but never in the same person, never. But when you do see them in the same person, it's beautiful. It's compelling. And when you see him walking through the pages of the New Testament, and you can do that if you're willing to take the time to consider it, you see an absolute beauty, and that is going to draw your heart out toward love, and that's going to reorder the loves of your heart. You know the place where Jesus said, I told you that if you believed in me, you would see the glory of God, verse 40? You know what that means? You can't look at the sun. You really can't look at the sun directly, or it'll burn your eyes out. So what do you have to do? You have to look at it through a filter, and if you look at it through a filter, you can't really see the glory of the sun directly because it would actually destroy your eyes. The glory would overwhelm you, so you actually couldn't see the glory. But if you look at the glory of the sun through a filter, then you see the flames and the light and the beauty. It's amazing. In Jesus Christ, you were looking at the glory of God through the filter of a human nature. And you see in his absolute highness and his absolute lowness, his truth, his tears, his greatness, his humility, an absolute beauty. And that's what's going to reorder your heart. So, you say, how can he be both God and man? How is that possible? It's hard to understand, right, but it's what your heart needs. Now, secondly, when he gets to the tomb, we don't learn so much about who he is, but what he came to do. And he came to do two things. The first thing we see is that he came to fight for us. Now, that's not as obvious as it ought to be, and I'll tell you why. Look at verse 38 and following. It's on the second page, and this is where he goes to the tomb now. He's done talking with the sisters, and it says, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. Now, listen, that word deeply moved, if you've ever heard me speak on this topic, I'll bring this up, but it doesn't seem like I've ever been able to find an English translation that is willing to go all the way with the word. The word that's translated deeply moved means bellowing with rage. It's a word that actually describes the roaring of an animal. And it's used almost always to describe someone who is trembling with rage, who's absolutely furious. Now, I think one of the reasons why the translators just don't go there is because it would just raise so many questions. It would be very enigmatic, but it would be puzzling. And yeah, it is a bit puzzling, but you know what? That's what I want to do, is I want to puzzle with you about it. Why would he be so angry? He went to the tomb angry. What was he angry at? Now, first of all, he wasn't angry at the family. He wasn't one of Job's friends. You remember what Job's friends were like? In other words, he doesn't show up and says, well, gee, Mary, Martha, I don't know why Lazarus died so young. You must have done something wrong. You guys better pray and repent and confess all known sin and get it right with God because, he's not mad at them. But now look, doesn't he claim deity? Doesn't he claim divinity? Yes. He's not mad at himself either. And that's pretty important to see. He's not mad at God. He's not mad at them. He's not mad at God. Why wouldn't he be mad at God? I'll tell you why. We talked about this last week. So let me just very briefly point it out. He is not acting as if this broken world with evil and suffering and death in it, he's not acting as if this world is not a world we deserve. The human race turned away from God, turned away from our Creator, turned away from the one who sustains our lives every minute, to whom we owe everything. The human race is turned away, and Genesis 3 and Romans 8, other places the Bible say, when that happened, the world broke. The world doesn't work the way it ought to work. We turned away from him. Everything about our lives broke. It wasn't the original design. Go take a look. God didn't originally invent evil and suffering and death. So Jesus is not mad at God as if somehow this world isn't the world that the human race deserves. Well, then who's he mad at? He's not mad at them. He's not mad at God. He's mad at death. It's the only thing left. He's mad at death. He's mad at the evil itself. One commentator, B.B. Warfield, says this about this verse, going to the tomb angry. It says, Jesus advances to the tomb, not weak and sniveling, but as a champion preparing for conflict. John uncovers the heart of Jesus as he wins our salvation, not in cold unconcern, but with fiery wrath against our enemy, death. So he comes to fight for us. And by the way, would you please notice that he's not stoic? You know, the Greek Stoics were always saying, hey, death, it's inevitable. Don't let it get to you. That's not Jesus here. And he's not a Christian Stoic. You know what a Christian Stoic is? A Christian Stoic is always saying, oh, it's really awful, but I'm just praising the Lord. I'm just thanking God. I'm just trusting him. No, Jesus is raging at the dying of the light. He's angry. He's furious. Okay. But, problem, we got a problem. If this world with suffering and death is our sentence, if it's our sentence, then how can he get rid of it? How can he deal with our enemy when we deserve it? How can he deal with it without hurting us? How can he deal with it? How can he remove it? And here's the answer. He didn't come just to fight for us. He came to die for us. That's the answer. That's how he's going to remove it. You say, well, I don't see him dying here. Well, look carefully. When he raises Lazarus from the dead, he triggers something. All of John chapter 1 to 11 is about the life of Jesus. This is John chapter 11. It's the seventh miracle. Up to now, it's been a narrative about the life of Jesus. So John 1 to 11 is all about the life of Jesus. But starting at chapter 12, all the way to the end, it's all about the death of Jesus. Why? Because in verse 53, which we didn't read here, immediately following, when he raises Lazarus from the dead, so publicly, so powerfully, his enemies get together and said, that's it. This is too decisive. This is too public. He's got to die. And verse 53 says, from that day forward, they plotted to take his life. Now, you don't think he knew that? Of course he knew that. He knew that the only way to get Lazarus out of the grave was to put himself into it. He knew the only way to give Lazarus life was to seal his own death, his own fate. He knew, by the way, the only way to interrupt our funerals was to go to the cross and have his own funeral. Listen, this is the only reason why you could explain psychologically why he is so grieved, why he's angry, why he's weeping. If you and I had the power to completely undo a funeral, if you and I went in to the funeral parlor and there was the deceased laid out, and if you and I knew that we had the power to raise that person from the dead, would you be going in weeping? Would you be going weeping? You'd be going in like this. Wait till you see. You wouldn't be weeping. How do you explain him being angry and weeping? I'll tell you why, because he knew what he was doing to himself. He knew it was coming. He hated death. He hated our enemy, and he also knew that the only way he could save us from it was if the great jaws of death closed on him like a vice, and he experienced the full wrath of divine justice on sin, and he took all the punishment that we deserve, and he did it. And the people there said, when they saw him weeping about Lazarus, they said, "See," in the old translation says, "Behold how he loved him." But they had no idea. They had no idea. And he didn't just do it for Lazarus, he did it for us. He knew the only way he could save Lazarus was by sealing his own fate. And guess what? He did it not just for Lazarus, for us. Behold how he loves you. Behold how he loves you. Now, that's what the miracle tells us about who he is and what he came to do. Let me just briefly give you a couple of practical implications. Just a couple of practical implications. Very important, though. Number one, would you please see here that Jesus is a model. There is no way to love people without suffering. Jesus knew the only way to love Lazarus was to do what? He was going to suffer. Now, of course, Jesus was saving him ultimately, so he went through the ultimate suffering. But I want you to know he is a model for us. You cannot love other people without suffering. And if you try to avoid suffering, you're not actually loving anybody. You're lonely. You're maybe using people. Maybe you're networking, but you're not loving them. Well, I'm going to give you 2 examples. Let's just say you've got a network of people who you consider friends. They're more of a network than friends. And there's somebody in that network you kind of like. You're not a whole lot, but there they are. And then one of them starts to go through an awful lot of trouble. Maybe emotional trouble, some financial trouble. And you know that if you even show interest, they're going to glom onto you, and they're going to want to talk, and they're going to want to share, and they may have, they have practical needs. And the only way to lift this person up out of the depths where they are is you're going to be emotionally drained. You might be financially drained. So it's them or you. You can either love them and lift them up and then be drained, or you can hold on to your privacy and your comfort and your convenience, and they just sink. It's up to you. You can love them and let them sink. No, and lift them up, or else you can not love them. And you see, it's either them or you. In other words, you have to die that others may live. That's how love works. Die in little ways. You have to die. Because the other example, of course, is parenting. Just to show you. Look, your children come into your life. There's 3 things you've got: privacy, convenience, and comfort. Now, you could, if you want to, say, I'm only going to care for my children in a way that does not compromise my privacy, my comfort, and my convenience, which means, of course, I'm only going to care for my children in a way that suits me, in which case your children will either probably not live to grow up, or if they do, they will be incredibly messed up people. So there's 2 possibilities. One is you can either love your children and just kiss your privacy, your comfort, and your convenience goodbye for 20 years or so. Or you can hold on to it and they'll be a wreck. In other words, it's them or you. You have to die that others might live. You have to die to some things. That's just the way it is. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to do that in your relationships? That's number 1. Number 2, kind of brief but important. Look, if Jesus Christ did this for you, if he is the resurrection and the life, he's God. But then if he was willing to lose everything for you, he's your Redeemer, not just your Creator. That means you owe him everything twice. Even if he was just your Creator and he hadn't redeemed you, you'd owe him everything. What that means is you just can't be nice to Jesus. You can't just like Jesus. You can't like Jesus. You have to worship him. You have to take all of the limits off your allegiance to him. He's got to be the reason you get up in the morning. It's all or nothing, or else you just are not coming to grips with who he is and what he's done. Look at him. You can't react mildly to someone like this. If he's in your life at all, he's got to be the center of it. Anything else is a crucifixion of the intelligence and a moral outrage. I remember some years ago I had a teacher that said this. It says, if the earth was, if the 92 million miles between the earth and the sun was reduced to the thickness of a sheet of paper, the distance from the earth to the nearest star would be a stack of paper 71 feet high. And the distance across the galaxy, the diameter of the galaxy would be a stack of paper 310 miles high, and the galaxy is itself only one little sort of speck of dust in the universe. And the Bible says that Jesus Christ holds the universe together with the word of his power, his little finger, as it were, and he gave it all up to come and save you. Is this the kind of person you ask into your life to be your consultant? Is this the kind of person you ask into your life to be your personal assistant, your helper? Is this someone to whom you say, I'll call you when I've got a problem? No, this person has to be the center of your life or shouldn't be there at all. And lastly, don't let death control you. There's all sorts of ways in which the fear of death controls you. Let me give you one example you probably aren't thinking about. I've had people, especially at a certain age, start to say, oh, I'm just never going to accomplish certain things. What? I don't think I'm ever going to be married. I don't think I'm ever going to have a family. I don't think I'm ever going to have the career I want. I'm never going to accomplish it. I'm never going to see the Alps or something like that. Oh, I'm never going to see it. When Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, do you know what that means? If you're in Jesus Christ, death cannot take anything away from you. It can only give you everything. You don't think there's mountains in him? Or something like it? Or something infinitely greater than whatever it is about mountains that you love? You don't think there's family in him? You don't think there's love? You don't think there's love infinitely greater than the greatest spousal love? You're not going to lose anything. Not a thing. What you can do is you can say what George Herbert says a Christian should say to death in the great dialogue anthem. George Herbert was a 17th century poet. You can find this online. It's a wonderful poem. It's called Dialogue Anthem. It's a dialogue back and forth between death and the Christian. And at one point, the last interchange, that death says, let losers talk, yet thou shalt die. My arms shall crush thee. And Christian says, spare not, do thy worst. You will only thereby make me better than before, and thou shalt be so much worse that thou shalt be no more. And what he's trying to say is, go ahead, death. If I'm in Jesus Christ, all you can do is make me better than I was. You can't unmake me, you can only make me. You can't make me worse, you can only make me better. You can't take anything away from me, you can only give me everything there is. I am the resurrection and life. And don't be afraid, he says, I've overcome the world. Let's pray. Our Father, we ask that the sacrificial kind of love we should have, the poise in the face of suffering that we should have, Lord, the fearlessness as we move through life that we should have, the lack of regret about anything, that would all come if we just grasp what you have shown us in this great miracle, that Jesus Christ, your Son, the God-man, is the resurrection and the life through his infinite sacrifice. We pray that some of these things would come home to us now as we partake of the Lord's Supper. Bring them in. Why do we live with any fear of regret? Why do we live in any other way than the large way we ought to live, knowing that Jesus Christ is our resurrection and our life and our Redeemer? Teach us.